We should have the right to know the specifics of our performance. The chain of respect continues to the customer, which makes for great service, satisfied callers, more business, and larger profits, which is the bottom line. The new monitoring system at Northwest Airlines is in its infancy, and I am looking forward to the many changes to come. There are others in this country who need to have some hope for their future. This bill is the answer.
Thank you very much. The attitude that you express, is that shared by others?
It's brand new. It's happening. It's going to take a long time to evolve, but we all do see that things are changing and that maybe it's going to be a little bit better for us. The people that are told every day when it's their turn to be monitored do have that feeling, that part of it. I don't know if they can see the whole scope yet, but it's improving.
But the feeling of being uptight, if I may generalize, have other employees shared that same kind of a feeling with you?
Oh, absolutely. There are also some that it doesn't bother at all. There's that type of person. But the ones that don't enjoy it express it, yes.
Ms. Cameron mentioned the lack of privacy has a tie-in with job performance. You want to expand on that at all, Ms. Cameron, and I'd be interested, Ms. Scott, Ms. Morrell, if you want to comment on that.
I can talk from people who call us who say that that there's this dynamic set up. If they're focused on just what Renee said, if they're focused on meeting these numerical goals, and they know that someone else is listening besides them, it gives people a real hard time in conveying to the customer complete knowledge of what they're talking about and efficiency in doing their job. People are focused on getting that person off the line, going on to the next one. People have told me about having their supervisors come in on the line while they're talking to someone and saying, excuse me, that's not quite right. How about explaining it this way? Which I would think is a whole lot more disorienting to the consumer than the potential of having a beep on the line, which just lets them know that someone else may be listening.
And why do people call you?
People call us a lot because they're feeling extreme stress and extreme pressure. They want an outlet. They want to know if there's something that can be done. The woman from the express mail company who called me was crying when she said, is this normal? Am I overreacting to the fact that my boss called me in and talked to me about, do I have a medical problem? A lot of people are very frustrated and they don't know where to turn. They feel like, are they crazy or is the company crazy?
And are these just isolated phone calls you get, or is this a pervasive?
We get hundreds of phone calls from a very wide variety of companies. Most of the complaints that people have are feeling that their dignity is being taken away. People will say, I'm a thinking adult. I had to pass a lot of tests to get this job. Why do I get more grades in a week than my children at school get in a whole year? Why am I being treated this way? So it's both the dignity and the extreme stress. Renee had mentioned the stress on her job. There's a lot of people who call us have stress-related diseases. They're on disability when they call us. It's when they get away from the job. They're on medical disability and they call us and say, I'm not sure I can go back.
Ms. Scott, you mentioned about supervisors taking 2 hours a day to go through this. Do you feel that adds to the productivity of New Jersey Central Power and Light?
No. I think it's just totally from the worker standpoint, I think it's very debilitating to them. You don't feel that you're being monitored in order to possibly help you do your job better. You get the feeling that you're being policed and that they are listening to you not to somewhere down the line help you with your job, either give you more training, brush up on something that may be a little weak in, but they're just trying to catch you talk to someone that you're not supposed to be talking to. We had an incident where the phones were very quiet one afternoon, and one of the customer service reps in one aisle called a rep in the other aisle just to say, I'm a little bored right now. One of the reps was being monitored, and the supervisor came out and scolded her like a little kid who had just walked through a mud puddle. So it's not very respectful as far as I'm concerned.
And Ms. Morrell said it would be interesting to have the bottom line, how much you bring in an income. for, in this case, Northwestern Airlines. It's more than interesting. That's a pretty basic statistic. But paying attention, the example I cited of Carbondale, where they don't say we're going to monitor Ms. Cameron, Ms. Scott, Ms. Morrell, but they take the overall office and compare it with other offices, and then they come and say, I assume, come to some office and say, you can do a little better in this office. That's a very different thing from the kind of private monitoring you're talking about.
Well, I think that the capability to monitor, and I don't think any of us here today are against being monitored on the job. Honestly, I don't know that I see the total need in it, but it's a new world, it's changing technology, and maybe it can be of some service to us. But I think what we're seeing is the way that it is actually used in reality on the job. It's not being used in any positive manner.
We're joined by Senator Metzenbaum here. Turn the microphone over to Senator
No, I
Metzenbaum.
just am here to listen. Thank you. I may have some questions for Mr. Barr when he testifies, but I just did want to show I'm interested in the subject, and I left the Gates hearing to be with you.
We've just heard from three people who are telling what kind of problems that we face. And again, I would stress, and Ms. Scott, you mentioned you're not opposed to all monitoring. Our bill doesn't knock out all monitoring. It simply puts some sensible restrictions there so that I think we could create a better labor management climate. I think we can create a climate that is more productive. As some companies are finding out, Northwestern Airlines will benefit by their changes. I'm reasonably confident, just as Carbondale has. And our friends in Japan apparently feel that their procedure is a much better procedure. We thank all three of you very, very much for being here and testifying.
Thank you.
Our next witnesses are Morton Barr, who is no stranger to this room, the president of the Communications Workers of America. We're happy to welcome him back once again. Dr. Gary T. Marks, the sociology professor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Mark Rotenberg, the Washington director of the Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility. Very pleased to have you here, and Morton Barr, you have another friend to your right there who is also a longtime friend of this committee, and you may wish to identify him for the record.
Lou Gerber, Senator, our legislative representative.
We'd be happy to hear from you at this point.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Senator Metzenbaum. We do appreciate the opportunity to testify in support of legislation that would prevent secret electronic monitoring in the workplace. In 1890, Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis referred to the right of privacy as the right to be left alone, the most comprehensive of rights, the right most valued by civilized men. But here, a century later, more than 10 million workers are subjected to concealed electronic surveillance each workday at job sites across the nation. Companies spy on as many as 400 million telephone calls a year between workers and the public. Managers covertly count the number of keystrokes workers produce every minute on video display terminals. Employers photograph wage earners who are honorably going about their jobs. These misguided methods render privacy rights obsolete. Most disturbing, businesses are expanding the practice of monitoring their employees. The number of such surveillance systems sold to companies soared by nearly 200% between 1985 and 1988, and sales continued to rise. To illustrate how secret electronic monitoring is running roughshod over the privacy rights of workers, I call your attention to 6 cases cited in the statement we submitted for the permanent record. This insidious practice not only tramples upon civil liberties, but also is taking a devastating toll on the occupational safety and health of workers. Just 1 year ago, CWA and the University of Wisconsin announced the results of the first major study conducted in the United States to investigate a possible relationship between electronic monitoring and workers' negative health symptoms. This landmark research project revealed that telecommunications industry employees who were monitored suffer significantly higher levels of psychological and physical problems than do workers in the same industry who were not monitored. One of the most alarming findings of the study was that 51% of monitored workers, and we're talking about secret monitoring, declared they were plagued by stiff or sore wrists, a rate 112.5% higher than cited by non-monitored workers. Mr. Chairman, a serious problem with computer monitoring is that it puts a premium on measuring a worker's performance through arbitrary quantitative standards while it ignores the value of qualitative human judgments. Computer monitoring can smother the ability of a worker to assist customers who have complex inquiries or to solve challenging problems. To demonstrate the distorted priorities that emphasis on mindless quantitative standards can engender, I've included in my written testimony an account from a CWA member of an instance in which a telephone company manager willfully disconnected a call from a person who had dialed the company and was telling an operator he was considering committing suicide. After a conversation of about 15 minutes between the would-be suicide and the operator, a telephone company manager intentionally terminated the call because, as the manager claimed, the length of the call was ruining the average work time, as the AWT you suggested in Bell of Canada, the average work time on all customer calls of the operators under that manager's supervision as measured by the company's computer. Telephone company operators are expected to complete calls from the public in about 20 seconds. In this case, the manager decided that conforming to the inanimate quantitative standard dictated by the computer was more important than saving the life of the would-be suicide caller. Mr. Chairman, employers claim that they need to use secret monitoring to ensure quality service. But evidence demonstrates that the absence of monitoring may actually improve service. 10 years ago, legislation prohibiting secret telephone monitoring was signed into law in West Virginia by then-Governor Rockefeller. Subsequent to passage of the law, CMP of West Virginia was ranked first in America among Bell System companies in 6 of 12 customer satisfaction categories, according to the company's official publication. And as you stated in your opening remarks, Mr. Chairman, many countries restrict monitoring by law. Without engaging in secret surveillance of their workforces, Japan and Germany, for example, America's two chief competitors in the global marketplace, have achieved robust economies, attained trade surpluses, and won the praise of American business leaders for quality and productivity. Industrial relations experts also agree that secret monitoring is a misguided practice. Professor Charles Heckscher of the Harvard School of Business has stated, and I quote, "Monitoring is a tool for bad managers. It's a crutch that allows bad managers to get away with a style we know does not work. The best way to get effective work out of people is to tell them what needs to be done and then get out of their way and let them do it. S516 would provide employees with the right to know when and under what conditions monitoring will take place. It would allow workers to earn their living without being subjected to the environment of an electronic sweatshop. In a report on electronic surveillance and civil liberties, the Office of Technology Assessment observed, in the last 20 years, there's been a virtual revolution in the technology relevant to electronic equipment. The law has not kept up with the technical changes. Mr. Chairman, the Privacy for Consumers and Workers Act would make a major contribution to closing the gap cited in the OTA study between the growing use of electronic equipment for employee surveillance and governmental supervision of its use. Most important, approval of the legislation would strengthen the right to privacy at a time when the expanding use of surveillance technologies at the workplace has endangered this most fundamental of American values. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Metzenbaum is involved in the hearing for Mr. Gates, who's nominated.
No employer, to our knowledge, ever left the state, but it was interesting to note that some blackmail took place after Governor Rockefeller went out of office. AT&T, and I use the word very deliberately, blackmailed the legislature and the governor that they would not open an office in Charleston with 500 jobs unless that law was repealed. And that caused that law to be repealed. List of statements made like that is made from total lack of knowledge and experience. We are negotiating and have negotiated with employers, monitoring with the employees' knowledge, and it works. In fact,
here, I'm a professor of sociology at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I teach and do research on the social, political, ethical, and public policy aspects of new information technologies with a particular interest in questions of privacy and civil liberties. In my testimony, I consider 5 issues at a perhaps broader level, which tries to put these things in a context of the whole society, of other countries, and American history. The 5 issues I consider in my paper are, first, the need to see that electronic monitoring of workers doesn't stand alone, but is part of a much broader set of changes that are capable of destroying boundaries that are fundamental to our sense of self and the separation of the public and the private. Video cameras, drug testing, electronic location monitoring, satellite surveillance. This morning in the Wall Street Journal coming down, I read about a new device created by a Massachusetts company. It's a small electronic drug testing device. It can detect microscopic amounts of drugs from the air, dust, and clothing samples. It's handheld. It's the size of a flashlight. And what happens is it's a kind of vacuum. And so you vacuum the person's clothes, you vacuum the desk where they were sitting, and it presumably will give you evidence of drug residue. And it can be done whether or not a person is there. That's simply one minor example. The second broad point I make has to do with the importance of this kind of legislation in the United States' context, where interest groups, in spite of my distinguished colleague to my right here, representing workers, are not as strong as they once were, where we don't have the traditions and the laws that Europe have, which guarantee workers a safe and healthy work environment with respect to management practices, not simply what's in the air. We also don't have the tradition of cooperation between workers and employers that one finds in Europe. So Congress is really the last resort for generating these protections that are so badly needed. I talk about some techno-fallacies in the worldview of those who advocate unrestrained monitoring. I talk about some broad principles that ought to underlie laws and policies protecting us from unwarranted electronic surveillance. And finally, I talk about the possibility, ironically, of using monitoring to create a more equitable, accountable, and productive work environment by extending it upward. If it really works for workers, if it's so terrific as the advocates claim, why not apply it to management, whose errors and violations can do far, far more damage than can an isolated worker? As a professor, unaccustomed as I am to talking for 5 minutes, I'll simply give some sense of the techno-fallacies and then some of the principles that I think ought to be there. I've identified what I call a large number of, quote, tarnished silver bullet techno-fallacies of the information age. I'm an ethnographer. I watch and I listen, and I hear things, much as a musician knows that some notes are off-key. I hear things that I know are wrong, whether morally, empirically, legally, or logically. Quote, turn the technology loose and let the benefits flow, unquote. Monitoring is for the worker's own good. Do away with the human interface. When you choose to make a phone call, you're consenting to have your phone number released. The public interest is whatever the public is interested in watching. These are all direct quotes. There's no law against this. The system is free of human bias. The technology is neutral. And in the testimony, I identify 6 techno-fallacies, and I elaborate on these, that I'll just mention. First is the fallacy of assuming that technology is only a means of increasing productivity and profits and improving service, rather than also a means, as it is in parts of Europe, to enhance job satisfaction for workers. A second fallacy is the fallacy of assuming that personal information on workers or customers that the company can collect is just another commodity like raw materials to be combined, reused, or sold as the company sees fit, without informing and obtaining the consent of the subject. A third fallacy is the fallacy of implied consent and free choice, which one well-known employer said to an employee who complained about monitoring practices, well, if you don't like it, simply go work somewhere else. But in fact, if all employers in a particular area are engaging in these practices, that's a rather specious freedom of choice. A fourth fallacy is the fallacy that machine-generated facts speak for themselves and are necessarily more valid, reliable, and neutral than human-generated facts. And there's much one could say about the acontextual nature of electronic data, that it's ripped out of its human context, that it needs to be interpreted. Fifth is the fallacy of confusing quantity with quality and what can be easily measured with what is important. And of course, as many people have noted, in emphasizing how many and how much and how fast, it's easy to lose sight of how well. Sixth and final fallacy is the fallacy of assuming that people are best controlled through deception and the creation of uncertainty by not telling them that they are monitored or will be monitored. And there's certainly empirical and theoretical evidence to contradict those. Now, an antidote to having always react negatively and after the fact to these fallacies is to develop positive, affirming principles. A nice beginning in this regard is the Code of Fair Information Practices developed in 1973 for the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. It contains 5 principles: a principle of informing subjects, a principle of data inspection, a principle of consistent usage, a principle of correction, and a principle of relevance. I would suggest adding to those a principle of co-determination, so that in a work context, people subject to information extraction technology have some involvement, a principle of minimization so that only data that's relevant and pertinent is collected, a principle of validity, a principle of timeliness, a principle of data security, a principle of human review, a principle of redress, a safety net or equity principle, and a principle of consistency so that broad ideals rather than the specific characteristics of a technology determine privacy protection. Let me conclude by noting that I was raised in Hollywood, California. One of my most vivid childhood memories is seeing the film The Wizard of Oz. I was terrified, as most of us were, by the power of the wizard. The fact that he was unseen made it possible to conjure up images of a truly ferocious entity who might be anywhere and remotely cause anything to happen. The lightning and thunder he controlled and his deep and authoritative commands were very intimidating. But as you may recall, at the end of the film, the little dog Toto pulls the curtain away, and the wizard is revealed to be an elderly and frail man. At once, we hear him say, quote, "Pay no attention to the little man behind the curtain with a microphone in his hand. The great Oz has spoken." But if the United States is to remain a decent and productive society in which technology is put in the service of its citizens, we must pay attention to the men and women behind the electronic curtain, and not only to those in front of it. The Privacy for Consumers and Workers Act is important because it helps us do that. Thank you.
Thank you. You got a lot of words in those 5 minutes. Mr. Rotenberg.
Thank you, Senator. CPSR is a national membership organization of computer scientists. We have a particular interest in privacy issues and have testified before a number of panels in support of efforts to protect privacy. We also believe strongly that in the design of computer systems, workers should be able to participate and help shape the technology that affects their lives. I should say at the outset that CPSR does not necessarily believe computer technology undermines privacy. There is certainly the Orwellian specter of large databases containing a great deal of personal information, and we are aware of this problem. But we believe at the same time that technology can be channeled in such ways so as to promote worker satisfaction, improve democratic decision-making, and afford basic protection for human dignity. Thus, our interest in this legislation is in supporting an effort that we believe will advance these goals. Let me speak briefly about 3 points that we think are critical to this effort. As I stated before, we believe that worker participation in the design of computer systems is a critical aspect of technological development. It has a tendency to promote greater innovation and job satisfaction. Employees should know how technology is affecting their lives, and increasingly companies are beginning to understand this. As Mr. Barr stated earlier, Professor Heckscher at the Harvard Business School has said that good managers have no need for secret monitoring. And a study of Fortune 500 companies that was performed by David Linhaus, the former chair of the Privacy Protection Study Commission, found that employee relations improved at both IBM and Citibank when data collection about personal information was minimized. This is the first point. Workers should play a role in the design of the technology. The second point is that businesses that collect personal information have a responsibility to their employees to safeguard that information. From a safety viewpoint, this responsibility is no different from the employer's obligation to ensure that the staircase is secure or that the ice has been removed from the entryway. Computer people are particularly sensitive to this problem because we know that personal information can easily be misused. As Professor Gary Marks stated a moment ago, in 1973, HEW put together a task force on privacy protection and came up with a set of principles called the Code of Fair Information Practices. These were designed to give an outline for organizations that were collecting personal information and to ensure that privacy would be protected. Now, there were 5 principles here that are really the foundation for privacy protection in this country. The first one is that there should be no secret personal data record-keeping systems. People should be aware of the information that is kept about them. They should also know how the information is being used. That's an important part of information privacy. They should have access to personal information and the opportunity to correct and amend the information if necessary. The organization that collects the personal information also has a responsibility to ensure its accuracy, its timeliness, also its completeness, so that information that is inaccurate will not cause some person unnecessary harm. And finally, information that is collected for one purpose should not be used for another purpose without the person's consent. These 5 principles, as I said, are a critical component of the principles that undergird privacy protection, not only in the United States, but in many countries abroad. My third point this afternoon is that CPSR believes computers should assist, but not replace, human decision-making, and the Europeans are particularly sensitive to this problem. Joe Weizenbaum, a professor at MIT in computer science, wrote with great force in a book called Computer Power and Human Reason that we should be careful not to substitute the precision that a computer system provides with the reasoning that a person can make. So, finally, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to say that for the past year, there's been a great deal of work taking place on the privacy front regarding recent developments in the European community and the efforts to develop an EC-wide privacy protection policy. It is becoming increasingly apparent that the United States lacks privacy protection in certain critical areas, and the absence of this privacy protection may in the years ahead have some consequences for international trade. I have participated in a series of meetings with the Europeans, and one of the points that they oftentimes refer to is the failure of the United States to develop a comprehensive statute for workplace privacy. For that reason and for several others, we think this is clearly a step in the right direction. Very pleased with your efforts.
Thank you very, very much. Mr. Barr, you used the phrase in your final sentence that we've been bringing up a lot in another hearing on a Supreme Court nominee, the right of privacy. It is there are those who say there is no right of privacy guaranteed in the Constitution. But the reality is the Constitution says you can't go into your home and search it without a warrant. The Constitution says you can't have troops quartered in your home. And then the Ninth Amendment was added, which was added at the suggestion of Alexander Hamilton. James Madison wrote the Constitution and wrote the Bill of Rights, and Alexander Hamilton in correspondence said, if we have a Bill of Rights, some people will say these are the only rights people have. So the Ninth Amendment was added saying other rights not spelled out here are reserved to the people. When they wrote the Constitution, they didn't have any idea we were going to be having telephones and computers and all the kinds of things that we have here. But the right of privacy that all three of you have talked about is really part of the spirit of the Constitution, in my opinion. But so I think it is one of the things that we need to safeguard in this country. And part of the aim of this bill is to safeguard that very fundamental right. One of the, and I'd like to ask all three of you this next question, because we also want to have a country that is productive. And one of the first three witnesses, and I forget which one it was,